गतिश्चान्दकवृष्णिसात्वताम् प्रसीदतां मे भगवान् सतां पति।
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Prabhu, can you make the page a little bigger? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. श्रियः पतिर्युगा पतिः प्रजापतिः धियं प्रतिर्लोका प्रतिर्धरा पतिः पतिर्गतिश्चन्धका वृष्णिशतवतं प्रसीदतं मे भगवान् शतं पतिः।
श्रियापतिर्यज्ञपति प्रजापतिर्ध्येयं पतिर्लोकपतिर्धारापति पतिर्गतिश्चण्डका वृष्णिसात्वतां प्रसीदतां मे भगवान् सतां पति। हरे कृष्ण।
श्रेयपतिर्यज्ञपति प्रजापतिर्धियां पतिर्लोकपतिर्धरापति पतिर्गतिश्चाण्डकच् वृष्णिसात्वतां प्रसीदतां मे भगवान् सतां पति।
Okay. Shriyaha, all opulence. Patihi, the owner. Yajna, of sacrifice. Patihi, the director. Prajapatihi, the leader of all living entities. Dhiyam, of intelligence. Patihi, the master. Loka Patihi, the proprietor of all planets. Dhara, earth. Patihi, the supreme. Patihi, head. Gatihi, destination. Cha, also. Andhaka, one of the kings of the Yadu dynasty. Vrishni, the first king of the Yadu dynasty. Satvatam, the Yadus. Prasidatam, be merciful. May, upon me. Bhagavan, Lord Shri Krishna. Satam, of all devotees. Patihi, the Lord. Translation. May Lord Shri Krishna, who is the worshipable Lord of all the devotees, the protector and glory of all the kings like Andhaka and Vrishni of the Yadu dynasty, the husband of all goddesses of fortune, the director of all sacrifices, and therefore the leader of all living entities, the controller of all intelligence, the proprietor of all planets, spiritual and material, and the supreme incarnation on the earth, the supreme all in all, be merciful upon me. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Since Shukadeva Goswami is one of the prominent Gata Vyalikas who are freed from all misconceptions, he therefore expresses his own realized perception of Lord Sri Krishna as being the sum total of all perfection, the personality of Godhead. Everyone is seeking the favor of the goddess of fortune, but people do not know that Lord Sri Krishna is the beloved husband of all goddesses of fortune. In the Brahma Samhita, it is said that the Lord, in his transcendental abode, Goloka Vrindavan, is accustomed to herding the Surabhi cows and is served there by hundreds of thousands of goddesses of fortune. All these goddesses of fortune are manifestations of his transcendental pleasure potency, Hladini Shakti. In his internal energy, and when the Lord, all of these goddesses of fortune are manifestations of his transcendental pleasure potency, Hladini Shakti, in his internal energy. And when the Lord manifested himself on this earth, he partially displayed the activities of his pleasure potency in his Rasa Leela, just to attract the conditioned souls, who are all after the phantasmagoria pleasure potency in degraded sex enjoyment. The pure devotees of the Lord, like Shukadev Goswami, who was completely detached from the abominable sex life of the material world, discussed this act of the Lord's pleasure potency, certainly not in relation to sex, but to relish a transcendental taste inconceivable to the mundaners who are after sex life. Sex life in the mundane world is the root cause of being conditioned by the shackles of illusion, and certainly Shukadev Goswami was never interested in the sex life of the mundane world. Nor does the manifestation of the Lord's pleasure potency have any connection with such degraded things. Lord Chaitanya was a strict sannyasi, so much so that he did not allow any woman to come near him, not even to bow down and offer respects. He never even heard the prayers of the Devadasis offered in the temple of Jagannath, because a sannyasi is forbidden to hear songs sung by the fair sex. Yet, even in the rigid position of sannyasi, he recommended the mode of worship preferred by the gopis of Vrindavan as the topmost loving service possible to be rendered to the Lord. And Srimati Radharani is the principal head of all such goddesses of fortune, and therefore she is the pleasure counterpart of the Lord and is non-different from Krishna. In the Vedic rituals, there are recommendations for performing different types of sacrifice in order to achieve the greatest benefit in life. Such benedictions, as the results of performing great sacrifices, are, after all, favors given by the goddess of fortune, and the Lord, being the husband or lover of the goddess of fortune, is factually the Lord of all sacrifices also. He is the final enjoyer of all kinds of yajna. Therefore, Yagnapati is another name of Lord Vishnu. It is recommended in the Bhagavad Gita that everything be done for the Yagnapati, Yagnartat Karmanaha. For otherwise, one's acts will be the cause of conditioning by the law of material nature. Those who are not freed from all misconceptions, Vyalikam, perform sacrifices to please the minor demigods, but the devotees of the Lord know very well that Lord Sri Krishna is the supreme enjoyer of all performances of sacrifice. Therefore, they perform the Sankirtana Yagna, Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnaho, which is specifically recommended in this age of Kali. In Kali Yuga, performance of other types of sacrifice is not feasible due to insufficient arrangements and inexpert priesthood. We have information from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, that Lord Brahma, after giving rebirth to the conditioned souls within the universe, instructed them to perform sacrifices and to lead a prosperous life. With such sacrificial performances, the conditioned souls will never be in difficulty in keeping the body and soul together. Ultimately, they can purify their existence. They will find natural promotion into spiritual existence, the real identity of the living being. A conditioned soul should never give up the practice of sacrifice, charity, and austerity in any circumstances. And the aim of all such sacrifices is to please the Yagnapati, the personality of Godhead. Therefore, the Lord is also Prajapati. According to the Katha Upanishad, the One Lord is the leader of the innumerable living entities. The living entities are maintained by the Lord. Eko bahunam yo vidati kaman. The Lord is therefore called the supreme Bhuta Brit, or maintainer of all living beings. Living beings are proportionately endowed with intelligence in terms of their previous activities. All living beings are not equally endowed with the same quality of intelligence, because behind such development of intelligence is the control of the Lord, as declared in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 15, verse 15. As Paramatma, Supersoul, the Lord is living in everyone's heart, and from him only does one's power of remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness follow. Mata smritir jnanam apohanam cha. One person can sharply remember past activities by the grace of the Lord, while others cannot. One is highly intelligent by the grace of the Lord, and one is a fool by the same control. Therefore, the Lord is Dyampati, or the Lord of intelligence. The conditioned souls strive to become lords of the material world. Everyone is trying to lord it over the material nature by applying his highest degree of intelligence. This misuse of intelligence by the conditioned soul is called madness. One's full intelligence should be applied to get free from the material clutches, but the conditioned soul, due to madness only, engages his full energy and intelligence in sense gratification, and to achieve this end of life, he willfully commits all sorts of misdeeds. The result is that instead of attaining an unconditional life of full freedom, the mad conditioned soul is entangled again and again in different types of bondage in material bodies. Everything we see in the material manifestation is but the creation of the Lord. Therefore, he is the real proprietor of everything in the universes. The conditioned soul can enjoy a fragment of this material creation under the control of the Lord, but not self-sufficiently. That is the instruction in the Ishopanishad. One should be satisfied with the things awarded by the Lord of the universe. It is out of madness only that one tries to encroach upon another's share of material possessions. The Lord of the universe, out of his causeless mercy upon the conditioned souls, descends by his own energy, Atmamaya, to re-establish the eternal relation of the conditioned souls with him. He instructs all to surrender unto him instead of falsely claiming to be enjoyers for a certain limit under his control. When he so descends, he proves how much greater is his ability to enjoy, and he exhibits his power of enjoyment by, for instance, marrying 16,000 wives at once. The conditioned soul is very proud of being the husband of even one wife, but the Lord laughs at this. The intelligent man can know who is the real husband. Factually, the Lord is the husband of all the women in his creation, but a conditioned soul under the control of the Lord feels proud to be the husband of one or two wives. All these qualifications, as the different types of pati mentioned in this verse, are meant for Lord Sri Krishna. And Shukadeva Goswami has therefore especially mentioned the pati and gati of the Yadu dynasty. The members of the Yadu dynasty knew that Lord Sri Krishna is everything, and all of them intended to return to Lord Krishna after he had finished his transcendental pastimes on the earth. The Yadu dynasty was annihilated by the will of the Lord because its members had to return home with the Lord. The annihilation of the Yadu dynasty was a material show created by the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, the Lord and the members of the Yadu dynasty are all eternal associates. The Lord is therefore the guide of all devotees, and as such, Shukadeva Goswami offered him due respects with love-laden feelings. And the translation again. May Lord Sri Krishna, who is the worshipable Lord of all devotees, the protector and glory of all the kings like Andhaka and Vrishni of the Yadu dynasty, the husband of all goddesses of fortune, the director of all sacrifices, and therefore the leader of all living entities, the controller of all intelligence, the proprietor of all planets, spiritual and material, and the supreme incarnation on the earth, the supreme all in all, be merciful upon me. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminati Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gaurabhani Pacharne Nirvishesha Shunyvari Pashtachi Deshatane Om Ajnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Okay, thank you again for joining. Today's purport was fairly lengthy and quite detailed. Some of the parts of this purport, especially if one hasn't read the Sanskrit or the word for word like we did, may not seem easy. We may not seem to easily understand the connection between what was written in the purport and what was written in the verse, right? The first paragraph, for example, was talking about degraded sex life and contrasting that with the pure form of love as displayed between the Supreme Lord and his transcendental pleasure potency. So if one just read the English translation of the verse and then started reading this purport, one might not understand why Srila Prabhupada is addressing this topic here, right? It's a topic that's often addressed, but one might not see the connection in this particular instance, right? So what I want to do first is I want to gloss over the entire purport to provide a little bit of context for each paragraph, because there's actually a reason why each of these items is there. And then after I do that, just to give an idea of why we talked about all these different things that we talked about, regarding this particular prayer of Shukadeva Goswami. After we gloss over that, then I want to get a little bit into detail on why it's important to understand these things on a deeper level, so that we can understand and apply the primary objective of our philosophy and avoid getting lost in the hall of mirrors like maze of the secondary aspects of the process of bhakti, right? Often I speak about principles and details. You've heard me say this a lot. And also lately, I've also been talking about substance and shadow, the difference between what's real and then what's a reflection. So primary and secondary, it's the same concept. I just find it helpful to sometimes use different terminology for the same thing, because first of all, it avoids me sounding like a skipping record. And then second of all, oftentimes we can get lost in terminology. Sometimes if we hear the same thing over and over, but we can't quite relate to it, it's better to basically say the same thing, but in different words. That way, if we're not catching it from one angle, we can catch it from another angle, just because sometimes we get lost in words, especially the English language. We use words very differently. And so sometimes, and I've discussed this before, there's a word like surrender in the English language. We don't like this word surrender because it sounds like we're about to be exploited by someone if we're surrendering to someone, right? But surrender is a very important aspect of Krishna consciousness, so we have to understand the true context of it. So sometimes we just get lost in words. I'll give an example. Is there was one devotee recently who he was going to give some classes on Sri Brahma Samhita and the commentary of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And just the vocabulary, English wasn't his first language, so the vocabulary of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is quite advanced. And so this devotee showed me this paragraph and he said, this is really technical. Can you explain what he's talking about? And I said, yeah, you know how Srila Prabhupada says, over and over in these different purports, and then I explained a concept and he said, yeah, I understand that. And I said, well, this is exactly what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is saying. It's just in different words. So it can seem, sometimes even though the same concept is being presented, we can't quite catch it because of the words. So like I said, I've spoken about principles and details, substance and shadow. So today I'm going to try to say it in terms of primary and secondary, because our primary goal is one thing. And then we have these various secondary things that go along with it that help us to achieve that primary goal, but aren't necessarily the goal in itself. So anyway, sometimes we get tripped up in vocabulary, but so we'll change these terms. And see, today's verse and purport, each of these paragraphs honestly could be subjects of their own class, right? But we're going to try to give an overall understanding because they all have the same underlying principle once there. So we'll gloss over and then we'll get to that primary understanding. Actually, though, but before we do that, I thought we might do something because I'm curious about something. So I'm actually about to ask feedback. So if anyone wants to contribute today, get ready to unmute yourselves. I know sometimes it's good to have a heads up when the speaker's about to ask a question, because otherwise you miss part of the question and you don't know how to answer. So here's your heads up. So when I read this verse, today's verse, I immediately thought of a particular Bhagavad Gita verse, right? And so I want to see if anyone else, if any part of this verse or even parts of the purport or like that reminded them of a verse from Bhagavad Gita. And I'm actually hoping that we get a whole bunch of different verses, because the way that the intelligence works is we come up with different connections based on our different experiences. And so with a verse like today's, there are various different aspects of it. There could be many different answers of different Bhagavad Gita verses that remind us of different aspects of this verse. So if anyone would like to explain or say which verse from Bhagavad Gita it reminded you of, and then why it reminded you. And again, there's no wrong answers, because it's just how the intelligence works, what connections we've made. So if anyone wants to do that, please unmute. You don't have to, but I thought this might be a good exercise. Or maybe today's verse didn't remind anyone of any Bhagavad Gita verses. Or you're just,
परित्राणाय साधूनां विनाशाय च दुष्कृतां धन संस्थापनार्थाय संभवामि युगे युगे, because the translation is mentioning that he's the protector of his devotees. So that's what I just recall.
Good. That's a good answer. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Vinjavali, you're unmuted. Do you want to add something? Mataji? Oh, no. Okay. Anyone else?
What about Janma Karma Chama Divyam?
Go ahead.
Janma Karma Chama Divyam Evam Yoveti Tarpataha Chakpadi Arpuna 90 months Arjuna.
And why did it remind you of that verse? Oh. Okay. Anyone else have a verse that this reminded you? Okay, so those are good answers. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if there's one verse in particular, but I've been doing the chapter a day with chapter 9. And this reminds me a lot of chapter 9, where, Krishna's talking about he is the sacrifice, he's the father, so that's where my mind kind of went to.
Yeah.
It wasn't one in particular in chapter 9, but just most of chapter 9, it seemed like my mind went to.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, all great answers and all very good connections. So for me,
Maybe
there's
Prabhu
another one.
Bhaktaram. Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I was just I was just thinking of Bhoktaram Yagni Tapasam
Yeah.
Sarvaloka Maheshwaram Suhirda Sarvabhutanam Natmamam Shantim Rachati is the connection.
Yes, yes. That's actually the one that I was thinking of. Because in this verse, in today's
Oh, I'm
verse,
sorry, Prabhu. I just
that's
took
okay.
you.
No,
I'm
thank you.
sorry.
No, perfect. It's nice to see what the different angles are, and I'm also happy to see that someone else also saw that. So in today's verse, you saw, for example, the term director of all sacrifices, right, which is Bhoktaram Nijna Tapasam. And then you also saw terms like the proprietor of all planets, spiritual and material, right? Sarvaloka Maheshwaram, right? And then you also had the leader of all living entities. And then the prayer is asking, please be merciful unto me. So he's also the beneficiary of all living entities. Good, good. Perfect. Thank you for all that. So we can see here that it's clear that Shukadev Goswami, who is making this prayer, right? He has already attained peace from the pangs of material misery, as explained in Bhagavad Gita 5:29. One who sees Krishna as all these things has attained peace from the pangs of material misery. So he already sees Krishna as all of these different things, of all of these different patis, right? And now he wants to help others cultivate attachment to Sri Hari. So our goal is not to just escape the material miseries, like it says here in 529, that one who sees Krishna in all these things attains peace from the pangs of material misery. So our goal isn't just to escape these pangs, but it's to achieve spiritual bliss. So it's not just to escape the material miseries, but also to achieve spiritual bliss. That just means to uncover our inherent natural pure bliss, right? So this is part of his prayer. He already understands all of this. And now he will present us with a deeper understanding on how one acts once they have attained peace from the pangs of material misery. So Maharaj Parikshit, who he's talking to, he's performed his duty as an emperor quite expertly in the service of Krishna, right? So now, knowing that he will leave his body in a week, it's time for him to bring that focus completely on just completely focusing on Krishna and leaving behind any secondary aspects of his devotional practice, right? The things he was doing, he was leading his empire in such a way that everyone was living piously, so much so that when Kali personified came and it was Kali Raja's time to come, Kali Yuga was coming, he couldn't find anywhere to go because nobody was acting impiously. Everyone was acting properly, right? So Maharaj Parikshit, as far as emperors go, you know, I mean, you can compare him to his father, of course, Yudhishthir. You can compare him like that, but otherwise, you can't really make a comparison. This is a very special. So, in other words, he wasn't just an emperor; he was an emperor devotee, right? He was doing it properly. So, although he was already engaging in devotional service, he understood, okay, now all of these other things that I was doing that are secondary, I have to just completely let those go, leave those behind, and just completely focus on the primary goal, which is to just, pure unalloyed bhakti, right? And so we will hear from Srila Shukadev Goswami, he will hear from Srila Shukadev Goswami, how it is that he can actually reach that goal. Brush aside all of those secondary aspects and then just focus on the primary. So here I should point out that we see that for some aspiring spiritualists, they're living their lives basically of sense gratification, right? And their goal is that one day that they can bring their life of sense gratification somehow in line with bhakti. So they pretty much want to get to a point where they're living somewhat like Parikshit Maharaj was while he was emperor and doing these things in Krishna service, right? And that's sort of the goal. But we see when we're talking about pure devotees aren't satisfied in that position. We see Parikshit Maharaj is not satisfied in this position. Bhishma Dev also is not satisfied in that position. When both of these great personalities understood that the time of death was coming, they set aside everything else and just completely focused on Krishna, right? So it's in our best interest to also follow in the footsteps of these devotees and not get tied up and distracted in the secondary aspects that go along with the culture or cultivation of bhakti, but really focus on that primary objective. So as I promised, we're going to do a quick gloss over to explain why these different points are in this purport. And I have to do this really quickly because we're already running out of time. So some of you may have noticed the repetition of the word pati throughout the verse, right? It's basically every other word. So here's the breakdown, and it's actually a very simple breakdown. So first we had Shriya Pati, right? It means the owner of all opulence. This is addressed in the first paragraph, that paragraph that was all about degraded sex life and then proper understanding of the true love, the substance instead of the shadow. So Krishna as the Shriya Pati is the owner of all opulence. Therefore, if anyone is claiming any opulence as their own, they are a thief, right? Isavasyamidam sarvam. Everything comes from Krishna. We may get some quota of something, right? Due to our past activities, we may qualify to have a portion of some of these opulences, right? But we should know that they're coming from Krishna and they should be used in a very specific way. So there's Shriya Pati. That's the first paragraph. Then the second term we got in the verse was Yajnapati, right? The director of sacrifice. And no surprise there, this is addressed in the second paragraph, right? So everything is to be done for the service of the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, it causes further conditioning and perpetual bondage to the material world, right? We have this verse, Yajna Shishtashina Shanto. It's talking about how the reason that devotees of the Lord are released from sin is because they eat food which is first offered in sacrifice, yajna, right? Others who eat food for sense enjoyment verily eat only sin. Now, I mentioned this many times. Even if you're eating a strict vegetarian diet, if you're not performing this yajna, if you're not offering to Krishna, then you are also eating sin. It's not what you're eating; it's the consciousness in which you're performing these duties. So if the consciousness is pure, then everything will be offered to Krishna before you accept any remnants, right? So Yagnapati, second paragraph. Then the next one, the next term is Prajapati, the leader of all living entities. And you guessed it, this is discussed in the third paragraph, right? So these are just point by point. Srila Prabhupada's going like this. Now there's a connection here from Prajapati to Yagnapati. There's a transition. So when Srila Prabhupada starts the paragraph talking about since the Lord is the Yagnapati, and because the living entities, as instructed by Lord Brahma, should never give up the process of sacrifice, charity, and austerity, because that's the way we can thrive. Then he's also known as Prajapati. So all of the living entities are relying on him, since we all have to, in order to make our living, perform these things, and he is the leader of all of those things. So it follows a line of logic. Then Dhiyampati, the master of intelligence, fourth paragraph. Again, we're just going down. So if we look in the Sanskrit, it's actually quite obvious. You see these terms and boom, 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 paragraph by paragraph. This is what's being described. The English, it's actually put in a different order. So if we just read the English and then we start reading the purport, we might think, why does this belong? I don't see the connection. So Dhiyampati, the fourth item, fourth paragraph. It's mentioned that knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness are given by the Supreme Lord, right? Natasmriti Jnanam Pohanam Cha. Therefore, he is the master of intelligence. He assigns the appropriate amount of intelligence to each living being based on their previous activities, right? So he is the master of intelligence. Then Lokapati, the fifth item, fifth paragraph, proprietor of all planets. So this one, again, it's a transition between the Dhiyampati, the one who gives intelligence. So Lokapati means if one is using their God-given intelligence from the Dhiyampati to try to make ourselves lords of this material world, right, then that's considered madness. That was mentioned in the purport. It's madness because when we are awarded with intelligence, which can actually help us out of the cycle of birth and death, and we instead use that intelligence to become further entangled in the cycle of birth and death, that's just utter insanity, right? But when the intelligence is directed properly, one can see clearly that the Supreme Lord is the proprietor of all planets, the Lokapati. And then we no longer try to control and enjoy our environment because we understand that the true controller and enjoyer is Krishna, Lokapati. The next item was Dharapati, the supreme incarnation on the earth, right? So sixth item, sixth paragraph. Out of his causeless mercy, he descends to this earth to help the rebellious jivas reawaken their divine consciousness. We jivas, on the other hand, come to this earth because we're trying to forget Krishna, right? So we have very different reasons for coming to this earth. So that's why he's the Dharapati, the supreme incarnation on the earth, because when he comes to the earth, he's actually doing so in a helpful way to help the jivas, as opposed to trying to, go against the natural system. So at this point, we've actually covered one line of Sanskrit. So it's half of the verse. So when we chant it, we subdivide it into basically 4 lines, but there's 2 lines of Sanskrit. So the 7th paragraph, which is the last paragraph, it covers the second half of the verse, which is Patir Gatis Chandaka Vrishni Satvatam Prasidam Me Bhagavan Satam Pati. So it starts with Pati and ends with Pati. So this whole verse is about Pati, right? So the beginning of it is Patigati and the end is Satam Pati. So this section talks about how Krishna is the Lord of all devotees and especially of the Yadu dynasty. And then Srila Shukadeva Goswami is requesting that the Lord, who is all of these patis, the Lord of everything, please be merciful upon him. That's the prayer. So that's the gloss over. So like I said, we could go into each of these paragraphs and just spend an hour discussing or even more. But I wanted to at least give a gloss over to show why these different items are there. You can go back again and see, oh, okay, yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense. That's why that's there. And especially the first paragraph, Srila Prabhupada talks about this often, where one might argue that, well, Lord Chaitanya, for example, he wouldn't even have direct contact or intimate contact with a lady because he's a sannyasi, but he's also preaching this gopi bhakti, right? The love of the gopis of Krishna. So it may seem to be contradictory. Similarly, it may seem to be contradictory that Shukadeva Goswami, when he's presenting the highest truth, is also presenting Rasa Lila, because one might say, no, one should be, detached from these things. But all of these things, when seen in the proper context, when understood in the proper context, that Krishna is all of these different patis, Shriya Pati, the owner of all opulence. When we see it in that way, we can understand properly, and then there's no issue because we're not trying to enjoy it for ourselves. We're appreciating how everything is revolving around Krishna. Right? So that's the gloss over. So now I want to spend some time, and it's not going to be a lot of time because we're running out of time. For the rest of this time, I want to focus on paragraphs 1 and 4, Shriyapati and Diyampati. So the Lord of Opulences and the Lord of Intelligence. Because recently I've been studying a book by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and I mentioned this, I think, in a previous class, called Sri Tattva Sutra. And I want to share with you some of the excerpts of that book that are pertinent to these 2 items mentioned in the verse. Actually, it's pertinent to the entire verse, but most specifically and directly to these 2. The primary or the principle goes through all of the verse, but you'll be able to see a connection with those 2 particular items. So in Sri Tattva Sutra, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Sutra 16, I'm just going to read the English. The characteristic nature and the inclination of the sentient beings are cognition and love, respectively. Now, this means, because again, we can get tripped up in vocabulary. The characteristic nature, right? So the nature of all living beings is cognition or intelligence, right? And the inclination of all living beings is love, right? So you have intelligence and love, right? So you could see how that can be related to Shriya Pati and Dhyam Pati, the intelligence and the love, right? Sutra 17. Love for the Supreme is natural, spiritual, and brings the highest bliss. Love for that which is not supreme is artificial, material, and brings only sufferings, right? So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Sutra 17 is showing how love, when it's for the Supreme Lord, when it's properly centered around the Supreme Lord, it's natural. So that's the natural state of the love. It's spiritual, means it's eternal, and it brings the highest bliss, right? But love for what is not supreme. So love for anything else, if you direct that love, which is our natural inclination of the living being, if that's directed toward anything else, it's artificial because it's improperly placed. It's material, means it's temporary, and it brings only suffering, right? So we can understand that. The way Srila Prabhupada writes his purports, this is all verified. Now, in this commentary, this is a very important and very interesting commentary on Sutra 17 of Sri Tattva Sutra, where Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur starts explaining. So first, there's a general explanation of how we can understand that love is actually our natural tendency. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes, love for the Supreme Lord is the natural inclination of the jivas. This natural relationship between the soul and the Lord can be compared with the magnetic attraction of the iron, the burning power of fire, and so on. So it's just a natural inclination. Fire is hot, iron is attracted to magnet. Just as the mentioned qualities are closely related to the respective object, the jivas are naturally related to the Supreme Lord by the tie of love, right? So this is a natural thing. Material attachments of the embodied soul are the perverted state of divine love. So it's love, but it's just focused on the wrong thing, right? So we're using our natural tendency and we're engaging it in something unnatural. That's what this means. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, when this faculty of the jiva becomes free of propensities, it shines as divine love. So again, he's saying that once we purify this love and redirect it from trying to enjoy it ourselves, with ourselves as the center, and redirecting our consciousness where we're using it in its natural state, which is toward Krishna, to please Krishna, and for us to be part of that service to Krishna, then that shines forth as divine love. So this is our natural tendency. Now, this paragraph is where it gets really interesting. At first, it sounds, yeah, we can understand it. Then it gets really interesting. So, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, love is the only inclination of the soul. It's the only inclination of the soul. Only its name changes according to the variation of propensities. For example, attachment for wealth is called greed. Attachment to female beauty is called lust, right? So that sounds, we've heard this before, right? Here's where it gets really interesting. When the same attachment is manifested to distressed people, it is called kindness, right? That one seems strange because this is talking about perverted love, right? And normally when we hear about lust and greed, yeah, that we understand that's perverted love. But when we talk about kindness, we generally think that's a positive thing, right, in the material world. But Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is pointing out that if we see that people are distressed and then we're offering them help in order to help them, it's kindness, it's love that's perverted to kindness because we're not actually understanding that the source of their distress is that they're separate from Krishna. And the only way to solve that problem, the only true kindness, is to remind them of Krishna, re-engage them in Krishna's service. So, and then he continues, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, attachment shown towards brothers or sisters is called affection. Again, we generally think affection is a positive thing, right? But if it's not centered around Krishna, then this is a misapplication of our natural inclination. Love is the only inclination of the soul. And so this is how it comes. Then Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues. And when it is applied toward the benefactor, it is called gratitude. Again, we think gratitude is a positive thing. But if we think that a material person is actually benefiting us and we're expressing gratitude toward them, we're not understanding that, no, Krishna is the supreme benefactor. Everything's coming from Krishna. It may be coming through another agent, right? A person may be giving something, but ultimately it's coming from Krishna. So if we're expressing the love only toward the middleman and not understanding the source of that, then that is a perverted reflection of that love. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, when this inclination, love, is favorably manifested, it is called love. And when it is unfavorably manifested, it is called enmity, right? So these things, gratitude, affection, kindness, these things are all actually enmity if we're not understanding that Krishna is the center and giving that love in its natural state. In this way, the same single inclination of the jiva, because there's no other inclination of the jiva, it's just love. The same single inclination of the jiva is transformed into various forms. This inclination of the soul remains in its unalloyed nature only for the liberated souls, where it can reach infinite excellence. Right? So then Sutra 18. Afflictions of the jivas arise only due to their secondary affinity to the world. So this means all of our sufferings in the material world are due to us being attached to the material world, right? Thinking that we're the center. Then Sutra 19. Because it restores the soul to its original nature, renunciation of materialism brings liberation. So one has to give up this idea of being independent, separate from Krishna, being independent controllers and enjoyers. Sutra 20. The material attachments of the jivas are results from the exercise of their atomic free will, which has been graciously awarded to them by the Supreme Master. So again, the reason we are suffering in this material world is because we misused our free will. We have a tendency to try to blame our sufferings on other living entities, on God himself, on different situations, but ultimately we are the only ones to blame because we misused our free will, and so we're here. And so if we understand that, then we can take the necessary steps to remove that covering, right? Because we're the ones that step behind the covering. We misused our free will. So it's also in our power to step out of that covering back into the light and bring that love, which is our only inclination, into its pure state again. And instead of it causing perpetual bondage, it then becomes an instrument of our liberation. Then, okay, there was another section I was going to read. I'm going to skip, and then I'm going to read one more section. And then we'll wrap it up and see if there are any discussions. So Sutra 37, divine knowledge brings liberation and mundane knowledge brings bondage. This relates to the dhyam. Then the very next verse, Sutra 38, it's the same exact words except for one exception. So instead of knowledge, now we're talking about renunciation. So proper renunciation brings liberation, whereas dry renunciation brings additional bondage, right? So both the love and the knowledge, so our tendency and our inclination, if they're used properly, they bring liberation. If they're used improperly, then they bring bondage, right? So to sum up today's class, and it was a lot, it always comes down to one simple concept. Our thinking, speaking, acting, and sense of being, if it's centered around our own sense of independent individuality, then that's going to be a cause of further bondage. If it's centered around Krishna, and it's guided by the instructions of the Guru, the examples of sadhus, and the instructions that are given by Krishna through the shastras and the scriptures, then that helps us get rid of that bondage, right? To become liberated from material and then connected then to Krishna, right? So we have to learn how to utilize everything properly in Krishna service. And for that, we take instructions from the Guru. We follow the examples of the sadhus, and we study the Shastras to understand what is to be done and what is not to be done, how we can favorably engage in Krishna service, right? So it's either we're the center or Krishna's the center, right? If we're thinking ourselves the center, then we remain in material bondage. If we understand that Krishna is the center and act accordingly, then all of that conditioning melts away, and then we can engage again in our natural state. So all of the patis mentioned in this verse are all to remind us that we are not the pati, right? Krishna is the ultimate pati. We may think that we are partial controllers of different things, and we may act in that way. We do act in that way. But when we see not only in theory that we are not these patis, these lords, and that Krishna is, and then we can act accordingly, knowing that all of these qualities are given by Krishna, and since they are given, that we should use them in the proper way. They're not ours to use as we wish. They're Krishna's to be used in a very particular way. So we consult Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, and we understand how to use everything that we've been given, everything we have access to, properly in Krishna's service. So we see that pure devotees like Srila Shukadeva Goswami understand this concept, right? And more importantly, he acts accordingly. Pure devotees, they understand it and they act accordingly. So in this way, we can benefit by following in the footsteps of these pure devotees, by seeing how they see Krishna as the center of everything, and then how they act accordingly, right? So I'll stop here to see if there are any questions or comments. I know it was a lot. There was a lot that we covered today. It was a long purport, and there's a lot that we can take away from it. But hopefully we covered something that will stick and that we can apply in our daily lives. So are there any questions or comments or further discussion? I don't see any unmutings. I may have overloaded everyone. I'm sorry for that. Okay, well, if there's nothing, then we can end here. Thank you for joining. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai.
Jai. Hare Krishna. Thank you,
Hare
Prabhu.
Krishna. Thank you, thank you.
Prabhuji,
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
And thank you all
Thank
for
you,
your
Prabhu.
input earlier. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabhu.
Jai.
At a point.